How's it going, everybody? Welcome to episode 2 of the series I am taking and calling Math Souls. Today I wanted to cover some information about critical hits, backstabs, and ripostes, and some information related to that. But before we begin, I just do need to make a couple of quick corrections from my last video. Of course, I was more so focused on weapon scaling, but I did talk about the auxiliary effects very briefly. And I just want to make some corrections there. So for bleed, which is the 300 in the bottom left corner, that is not the amount of bleed build up per hit, but rather the amount of HP that the enemy will lose whenever the bleeding effect is procced. For every weapon that inflicts bleed, this is 300, except for Priscilla's weapons, which are 500 for both of those. So a regular enemy would lose 30% of their HP and 50% of their HP when using either the Life Hunt Scythe or Priscilla's Dagger. These values are multiplied by 30% again whenever you're facing a boss. So bleeding a boss with a regular weapon deals 9% of their total HP and 15% when using a Priscilla weapon. Similarly, I said that the Divine modifier didn't actually increase damage, but I guess it does. I had always thought that it didn't for some reason, but after looking at it a little bit closer, it does indeed deal some extra damage. I was always under the impression that even though there was a number there, it just prevented skeletons from reviving. But that's what you get for not doing research. So just a general warning that whenever you're putting out information like this, just to be very, very critical of your own information and double check everything. Anyways, on to the video topic itself. Before we truly begin on our journey to discuss everything that goes on behind the scenes with critical hits, I just want to run through a couple of concepts though so that we can have a good idea of what's going on behind the scenes. The first of these is going to be the damage formula, and I've covered this a couple of times before, but effectively there are 5 damage formulas that the game has that it can choose from based on the ratio between the attack and the defense. Usually this is the attack and defense of the player character versus an enemy, at least whenever people are doing math for Dark Souls and whatnot. But this does also apply in the inverse for the enemy's attack versus the player character defense. For critical hits, you're generally going to be in the bottom 2 that I'm showing on screen. So those being whenever your attack is at least 2.5 times greater than the enemy's defense. And if you're in starting areas like Undead Burg with really high-leveled weapons, you might also find yourself in that very bottom tier where your attack-to-defense ratio is over 8. Now, there are a lot of numbers on screen. You don't really need to worry about these too much. This formula group is relatively linear. I'll put a graph up on screen showing the total damage based on the ratio between attack and defense for just a random attack value. And you can see that it is generally pretty linear. But, obviously, whenever you increase your damage, whether through your stats or your weapon level, you're going to do more damage. Imagine that. So our next topic is going to be motion values. And again, I have mentioned these in a couple of past video projects. But what a motion value is an attack multiplier that is based on the type of attack that you're using, if you are one-handing or two-handing, and the class of weapon. For the majority of weapons in the game, your light attacks in one-handed are going to have a motion value of 100. So the damage is going to be calculated using whatever the actual attack rating of the weapon is. When you're two-handing, the motion value for most weapons, again, is going to be 120. So the attack rating of your weapon is going to be multiplied by 1.2, and then the damage calculation is run. I'll show some examples here. I also have the numbers on screen. So for a broadsword plus 7, we have 295.81 attack rating. Again, it's rounded down to 295 on the stat screen, but if you watched last video, you'll know that the actual value used in game is not the 295, but it actually goes into the decimal places for the purposes of calculating damage. And because I'm at 99 strength and dexterity, you'll see that if I two-hand the weapon, the attack rating stays the same at 295. Again, this is because the hard cap for strength in Dark Souls 1 is 99. This is unlike Elden Ring. I think this is the case in all Dark Souls games, actually. Maybe Dark Souls 2 is a little different because that's in a different game engine. But yeah, regardless, our attack rating is going to be the same. So for a hollow here in the lower Undead Burg, or just outside of Firelink, they have physical defenses of 85. It's actually the same for strike, thrust, and piercing damage, but the broadsword just deals regular damage, so that doesn't really come into effect here. So the ratio between our attack and defense is going to be between 3.5 and 4.2, depending on whether we are one-handing or two-handing. So we use the formula down there with that appropriate ratio. If we do damage, you'll see that we do 226. It's actually 226.3, but it's rounded down. And then if we two-hand, we do 285.2, again rounded down to 285. Next is going to be the concept of an attack multiplier versus a damage multiplier. So there are two ways generally to increase your damage, and they fall into two different categories. Attack multipliers are going to be those that affect the actual attack of your weapon itself. These generally include things like the Red Tearstone Ring, the Dragon Torso Stone, and the Sorcery or Miracle Rings, whereas damage multipliers generally include things like the concept of an aura buff from later games, as well as counter damage. So Power Within counts as a damage multiplier. And again, we can see a practical demonstration again. Here we're using our broadsword with the one-handed light attack. If we go ahead and equip our Red Tearstone Ring, you notice that we have an attack rating of 295. Red Tearstone Ring goes on, and it jumps up to 443 on the stat screen. The actual in-game value is 443.71. And then if we do another hit against our Hollow buddy, you'll see that we do 376.7 damage, or rounded down to 376. And if you'll note that this actual increase in damage is about 66% and not 50%. So what this generally tells us is that an attack multiplier is almost always going to give you a disproportionately greater benefit than whatever the multiplier actually is. This starts to become less and less obvious, or less and less noticeable at high levels of attack, as of course if you already have a really high attack to defense ratio, that damage calculation formula stays the same. So increasing your attack by 50% will actually be the same only in that final tier, but for lower tiers, because you might even jump to a different tier, and because the formula is generally linear but not exactly linear, you're going to get a greater increase in damage using a attack multiplier than you would for a damage multiplier. Again, if we go ahead and throw Power Within on for an extra 40% damage, you'll see that our damage actually jumps up even higher to 527.3. And of course, what makes this so very, very strong in Dark Souls 1 is that these things can obviously stack. So if you compare that to the original damage, I mean, our attack is well above double damage here at this stage, which is kind of nutty, and it's one of the reasons why there are so many viable one-shots in this game. So again, just to recap, for these, attack multipliers are going to actually affect the attack portion of that formula and will generally give you a disproportionately high benefit in comparison to whatever the actual in-game multiplier number is, whereas damage calculation damage multipliers are applied after damage calculation is complete. So those are just going to be a straight increase in damage. Both good, of course, but if you had to choose one over the other, you would like an attack multiplier. So now that we have a baseline for some of the mechanics that are going to be used in this video, we can go ahead and head back to our lovely test subject and go ahead and show an example of some backstabs. So in my right hand, I have both the broadsword +7 and parry and dagger +15 equipped. You'll see on our status screen, they are about roughly equal in terms of total AR, and if you recall that using the Red Tearstone Ring increased our damage by around 66%. So you would assume that for a critical rating, which is also a attack multiplier and not a damage multiplier, we would be expected to get about maybe 40-45% more damage, maybe on a good day. But if we actually go ahead and do a backstab, you'll see that a broadsword does 528.2 damage. And then if we switch over to the parrying dagger, We get 865.9 damage, which is about 64% more. So this is the kind of main reason why I think that the values shown on the stat screen are a little bit misleading, and let's get into why that is. So the biggest reason, at least to me, again, that this is misleading is because every single weapon class in the game has its own sets of motion values for backstabs and ripostes. For kind of the standard weapons, straight swords, katanas, spears, and halberds, backstabs have a motion value of 200 and a riposte value of 250. And you can see that there's a variety of different ones. The interesting ones, at least to me, I think of note, are the ultra great swords, great axes, and great hammers, which have that kind of two-hit combo where you first do that little punch to the midsection or the back, and then you do your weapon swing. It's kind of the same thing for the smaller axes, hammers, and fist weapons, where they all do that kind of two-hit combo. And because of this, the value used for the critical rating on your stat screen, again, if we go back to the parrying dagger, it has a value of 131. So there are two different classes of weapons in the game, that those being thrusting swords and daggers, that have critical ratings over 100 for a couple of weapons. So again, because this is a straight attack multiplier and not a damage multiplier, what we can do is we can take the critical value, we can take the motion value, we can multiply those together because they will always be applied on backstabs and ripostes, and we can get kind of an effective motion value for the following weapons. For the parrying dagger and regular dagger, both of which have a critical rating of 131, our motion value for backstabs is 327.5, and for ripostes it is 393. For the bandit's knife, which has a critical rating of 147, which is technically the highest in the entire game, we have effective motion values of 367.5 and 441. For the mail breaker, we have an effective motion value of 324 for backstabs and 408 for ripostes. For the rapier, it is 297, 374, and then finally for the ghost blade, it is 317.5 and 381. Now, this is all well and good, of course, but again, kind of owing to the fact that motion values, which are completely hidden from the player, and the fact that some weapons and a variety of classes have critical ratings and others don't, again, just kind of leads to some of the confusion, at least I know that I had whenever I started looking at some of the mechanics, and I can recall that this value being confusing whenever I first started playing the game as well. Similarly, despite the bandit's knife, for example, having a super high motion value for a backstab, if we take a look at something like the magic great axe, which of course more than doubles its total attack rating, if we go up to our test subject buddy, even though our effective motion value for backstabs is super high and we get 1007 damage against this hollow, if we go ahead and use the great axe, we're still going to more than clear that, 350 plus 1189. So even though a lot of smaller weapons, again, the daggers and thrusting swords that have motion values that are really, really high, and for some weapons that have high critical ratings as well, they're still going to be outclassed in terms of total damage on backstabs and ripostes from higher AR weapons. And this even applies to some other weapons that maybe aren't quite as high in terms of damage, but that scale off of dexterity a lot better than, say, the great axe. Say if you're using like an Inuji katana or something that is a really good dex weapon, the total damage that you're going to be doing with a backstab or a post using those weapons will generally be quite a bit higher than if you're going to be using a smaller weapon that has a high critical rating. And then again, you can see that I'm not even at 99 intelligence, so we could even push our damage up a little bit further if we went all out and put our intelligence up to the maximum hard cap. A couple of final items of note related to backstabs and ripostes are weapon buffs and weapon auxiliary effects, as well as the Hornet Ring. The Hornet Ring is definitely the easiest of the three things that we want to take a look at the end of this video. Here again, if we do a backstab, we get 865-ish damage with the parrying dagger, and then if we go ahead and throw on the Hornet Ring, you'll see that our damage jumps up 30% to 1125. So this is just a straight up damage multiplier, very similar to Power Within, that is applied to each hit of your critical hit animation. So this does apply to both of the hits that you do with like a larger weapon such as the Great Axe. However, what is most interesting to me, and something that I didn't see anywhere online, I don't know if I'm the first person to discover this, but again, it is very interesting, is that weapon buffs do get this increase in damage from the Hornet Ring, but they do not get a damage increase from the Red Tearstone Ring, for example. Now, the Red Tearstone Ring might have been known already, but I'm not sure if it was necessarily known that Backstabs and Ripostes that do 2 hits, the damage that you have applied to your weapon, whether that's a resin or a spell buff, is affected by that 30% damage multiplier. And we'll show a test here with the Cestus. And for this test, I just went ahead and in the parameter files made the damage to 0. So you'll see that if we just go ahead and do a regular backstab, we don't do, actually we do 1 damage and 12 damage. Well, that's because I was using my fist. I guess if I go ahead and equip the weapon, you'll see that we actually do 0 damage on both hits. But if we go ahead and apply the gold pine resin, and we do not use the Red Tearstone Ring, if we go ahead and backstab, we get 104 damage and then 104 damage. So for each hit of a multi-hit backstab or riposte, we get the weapon buff damage on both hits and 100% of that damage. For the Red Tearstone Ring, you'll see that again, we do 104 damage and then 104 damage, so no increase. Again, I'm pretty sure that was known, but for the Hornet Ring, if we go ahead and do a backstab, you'll see that we do 135 damage and then 135 damage. So yeah, the 30% damage multiplier does come into play for any weapon buffs that you have whenever you're doing those 2-hit ripostes or backstabs. And then finally is going to be auxiliary effects. Again, poison, bleed, or toxic. So you'll see here that if we go ahead and apply rotten pine resin, it'll take 3 hits to poison this hollow. So 1, 2, and then 3, and then he starts taking poison tick damage. If we go ahead and use a weapon that does 2 separate hitboxes, you'll see that we'll do this. No poison cloud effect yet, but after the second animation, you'll see that he starts to get poison the instant that we stop the second hit on our backstab. So for status effects that are included with your weapon, again, I'm just using poison because it's the easiest to kind of demonstrate. The number of hits will remain the same, but each of the hits in your attack animation are counted as a single hit. So because the backstab with a fist weapon does a total of 4 hits, and it only takes 3 hits with the rotten pine resin to poison these hollows here in the Undead Burg, we do in fact get the poison, but the actual damage does not start to tick until we exit out of the actual animation itself, which again is very interesting to me. That one might have been known, but again, I think that the real interesting thing about weapon buffs is that the damage increase is applied from the Hornet Ring, even despite the fact that it is not technically part of the backstab, if you really think about it. Another quick note before we end, any damage that is tied to the weapon innately, such as this magic great axe, those damage types, so for this one magic, that will be affected by the Red Tearstone Ring and whatever other attack multipliers you may be using. So that's all for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Maybe you learned a thing or two. Again, I wasn't 100% sure on how some things were affected with critical hits before I started doing this. I had a general understanding, but really looking into some of the data and how the numbers are calculated was interesting. Again, if you want to actually go ahead and calculate the damage that you'll do with a critical hit yourself, I have included an updated spreadsheet. It's the same one that I put out for my last video. This one, however, does include a critical hit attack calculation in the spreadsheet. You will have to go through and find the defense for various enemies. The hollows up here in Undead Burg, at least the one that is not the one right next to the bridge that has the extra armor, all their defense is 85, which is where that number was coming from. The most commonly used one, I think, will be against Gwyn. Gwyn has 334 physical defense, so if you just want to get a total calculation for the physical portion of your critical hit following a parry and riposte, that is the value that you would use. Other than that, the only other thing I feel the need to mention is that plunging attacks versus both the Asylum Demon and Taurus Demon, as well as technically the Demon Fire Sage if you're playing an older version of the game where you could clip through the floor and do the animation. Those are not affected by the Hornet Ring, as they are considered a special attack and not a critical attack. So thank you so much for watching. I've got a couple other ideas for this series, as well as some other runs that I'll actually be doing a full playthrough of the game, so be on the lookout for those. Until then, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.